Hey there everyone, ladies and gentlemen, squids and squidettes, your Papa Yam is back with part 2 of our top cursed motorcycles videos. You guys loved the last one so much it only made sense to bring it back and see what other ungodly creations we can shed some light on. We got a lot of comments on that video too, not just criticizing my knowledge of Porsche lore, but recommending some obscure international bikes I hadn't previously heard of. So sit back, relax, grab your Ouija board, wear some garlic around your neck, and prepare for 10 more of the cursed motorcycles of all time. Today's video is sponsored by our friends over at VOOM Insurance. Let's get into it. As mentioned in the last iteration of cursed motorcycles, the criteria is relatively broad. A cursed motorcycle can be so poorly developed it is deadly. It can be so hideous that children cry in terror at the sight of it, or it can just be considered an utter failure in just about every single way. Just like what your dad said about you when you didn't catch the pop fly while in the outfield during your Little League baseball game because you were too busy pulling the tops off of dandelions and mentally ranking your favorite Pokemon. Has anything changed? Not really. All that being said, the first motorcycle on the list today falls into the deadly category. While the men in many countries chose to see heaven upon the saddle of large displacement two-stroke bikes like the Kawasaki H2 Mach 4 in the early 70s, in countries where small displacement bikes were more commonplace, they had a different demon they were forced to contend with, the Yamaha RD350. And while the RD350 was recognized as a force to be reckoned with in North America, where hubris and machismo are as common as baseball and apple pie, it had a more notorious reputation in India, where it was built and sold by the Escort Group under the name RAJDOOT 350. The RAJDOOT 350 was a licensed copy of the RD350 that produced in India beginning in 1983, nearly 10 years after production ended in Japan. Its two-stroke twin engine was very advanced for the time, compared to the relics of the Royal Enfield Bullet 350 that were considered to be industry standards. The RAJDOOT 350 also had many cost-saving measures put in place, like downgrading in the braking components, doing away with a disc in the front, and instead using 2-drum brakes. Yes, they reduced the braking power. These copycat RD350s developed an infamous reputation for being unwieldy, costly, and hard to maintain. Despite these clear setbacks, they retained a cult following and a notorious legacy. And as a quick side note, my dad in Brazil in the 70s actually owned an RD350, and he said it scared the ever-loving hell out of him. In 1997, Suzuki built the TL1000S. This V-twin roadster and the TL1000R race bikes that were built alongside it to compete in World Superbike were designed to take aim at bikes like the Ducati 916 in consumer sales, just as Suzuki would go on to make the SV650 to steal away some of the Ducati Monsters fan base. I don't know if Ducati just stole Suzuki's girl back in the 90s, but they really had it out for him. This bike was making 125 horsepower and 79 foot-pounds of torque from its 90-degree V-twin, one of the most powerful V-twin engines at the time. For 1997, this all sounds like good stuff, right? It had a nice swath of torque and made a delightful grumble from the exhaust. The engine was so nice that units were even sold to Cagiva and Bimota for use in their own machines. If a Japanese V-twin engine is sought after by 2 different Italian motorcycle companies, that must mean they've got a good thing going, right? So why is the TL1000S cursed? The problem with this motorcycle came from its suspension. Since V-twin engines are inherently longer than an inline 4, in order to retain a short wheelbase, it used a rotary shock, where the rear shock was separate from the spring. The spring was located on the right side of the bike and employed a rotary-style rear damper that provided its damping characteristics through rotating arms. This rotary damper would overheat the oil under heavy use and could lead to a complete loss of damping. The fate of the TL1000S was sealed when a notable motorcycle journalist was killed after he lost control of the bike during a tank slapper, inciting a global recall. The TL1000R race bike, despite only winning one race before being replaced with the GSXR 750, retains a cult following, despite reports of terrifying wobbles and shakes lest the rear shock be replaced. If you have a goated S-tier motorcycle, you do not want to be cursed with overpriced motorcycle insurance. That's why we're stoked to have today's video supported by our friends at VOOM Insurance. VOOM Insurance is changing the game for motorcycle insurance, providing the only pay-per-mile policy for motorcyclists. Your rate is dependent on miles ridden, making it the perfect option for seasonal riders, multiple bike owners, or weekend warriors who just don't rack up that many miles. VOOM doesn't require any clunky hardware. All you do is upload a photo of your odometer once a month, and you're insured to pay only for what you need. VOOM is currently available in these states. Many riders can save up to 60% by switching to VOOM. If you want to get a free quote and see how much you could save on motorcycle insurance, click the link down below and see how much you could save. We're so stoked to have Voom as a partner here on the channel. It's awesome to see the way that they're helping make motorcycling more affordable and accessible, which is really what we're all about here on Yami Noob. So get that free quote at voom.co/YamiNoob and let's see if Voom is a good fit for you. It's a free quote, no obligation, just go and check it out. Thanks to Voom for the support on today's video. Now let's get back into it. 25 years before BMW made the world's most luxurious two-wheeled golf cart known as the C1, a couple of Brits built an enclosed motorcycle that no doubt served as an inspiration for BMW Motorrad. The QUASAR was a semi-enclosed, feet-forward motorcycle built between 1975 and 1982. It took 5 whole years of production for a team of British designers to take a hint. Powered by a liquid-cooled 850cc 4-cylinder engine pulled from the 3-wheeled Reliant brand light car, the QUASAR was by definition a motorcycle, much to the chagrin of all motorcyclists. It has an engine and 2 wheels, but unlike practically any other motorcycle produced in the history of time and space, it had a fully enclosed cockpit with a roof and windshield. It is a motorcycle you don't sit atop of, but within. This has many limitations. Tall riders wearing actual helmets struggled to fit inside, carrying a passenger was nearly impossible, and no matter what, you were destined to look like the biggest dork on this side of Buckingham Palace. While riding a motorcycle, it is imperative to be cognizant of your surroundings. This proved monumentally more difficult on the QUASAR, which had 2 massive blind spots. Being sheltered from the rain in your enclosed motorcycle is inconsequential should you unknowingly drive into the side of a semi-truck hidden in your blind spot while you attempt the lane change. During the 5-year production run, only 21 units were actually produced, which result of limited funds and resources. The QUASAR was also featured on Top Gear in 1988, which was likely one of the few reasons the design has managed to hold any cultural relevancy. Despite only 21 models of the original design being produced, a completely unsubstantiated fact on an open online encyclopedia page claims as of 2012, there were still 10 QUASARs out there on the road. So if you've ever seen one, you've spotted a rare unicorn. I have never shied away from the fact that European countries typically have safer, more educated, and more skilled motorcyclists thanks to their regimented licensing system and road systems. You guys are better than us, I agree. But no matter how good their riders may be, some of the most obscure bikes built by European entrepreneurs are just downright unacceptable. What if I told you you could buy a car to drive in the winter, and then in the summer you could swap the engine into a motorcycle and ride that, and then swap it back over and over every season for infinitum? Does that sound like the stupidest thing you've ever heard? Does that sound like you asked a 10-year-old in remedial math to pitch you a business plan? Well, then you'd be incredibly prejudicial. But because such a motorcycle does exist, it was made by hardworking men and women who deserve your respect. And when you think of Italian motorcycles, you probably think of Ducati, Aprilia, MV Agusta, Moto Guzzi, but there's another spicy Italian red machine that defies all expectations, the Moto Shifty 900, baby. The Moto Shifty was built to use a 903cc engine from the Fiat 127, but it doesn't just use a car engine, it also used the Fiat's transmission and gauge cluster attached to the faux fuel tank, with the real fuel tank living beneath the seat. Other parts for this machine were pulled from other bikes like Benelli, Laverda, and Moto Guzzi. The Moto Shifty 900 is a really bizarre Frankenstein type of machine. Only 70 were produced between 1977 and 1982, and call me crazy, but I think that might be 70 too many. Motorcycles with car engines are cursed, full stop, whether it's a rinky-dink Fiat or a Boss Haas V8, and the next bike on the list also has a car engine. But given it was born out of necessity instead of hubris, I'll approach it with a little more crazy. From 1974 until 1990, the import of foreign vehicles into Brazil was halted, so all cars and motorcycles sold in the country had to be produced there. Auto manufacturers like Ford, Volkswagen, Fiat, and Volvo all operated manufacturing facilities in Brazil. And as a result of these import bans, there was a need for nationally produced motorcycles, and Brazilian motorcycle company Amazonas thought, man, designing and building an engine just seems like so much work. If only there was another way. So the big-brain businessmen they opted to instead put the 1584cc air-cooled boxer engine for the Volkswagen Beetle in a motorcycle. As a side note, as a Brazilian who has many contacts in Brazil, my family back in the 60s and 70s were all obsessed with the Volkswagen Beetle. I think it's like all they had. Everyone I knew had a Beetle. They souped them up. They raced them down the mountains. It's just crazy. Prior to the Amazonas, the most motorcycles sold in Brazil were small and displacement. The Amazonas 1600 was a beefy boy that defied the expectations of local riders. The model was sold for civilians, the military, and police. The civilian version was limited to just 53 horsepower, but the police version was putting down a whopping 68 ponies and 80 foot-pounds of torque. This motorcycle used a Volkswagen transmission, including a reverse gear. Why would they get rid of it? Of course not. Considered by many to be one of the worst motorcycles ever made, this 900-pound behemoth was the product of economic motivation with no consideration to much else. Alright, this is the last car parts bin motorcycle, I promise. A French guy named Louis-Marie Bocardo made it his life's work to make the worst motorcycle known to man. He just hates us all. His journey started when two other French guys experimenting in the world of small business wanted to start a motorcycle company, but they didn't know anything about engineering. And in order to pitch their business to the government to be awarded grants, they petitioned Bocardo as their lead engineer, as Bocardo has experience as a motorcycle technician for a Grand Prix race team. Kind of a stretch, but okay. In 1978, they were loaned some money, made the company BFG, cleverly after the initials of the founder. Very unique, right? Never seen that before. After starting BFG, they began building a motorcycle. Bocardo designed the frame, and then lo and behold, they used a bunch of leftover car parts, including the engine of a Citroën GS. This bike would be called the BFG 1300. Kind of a sick name, honestly. The big frickin' gun 1300. I don't know. Kind of reminds me of Doom. 400 models were made, and then they ran out of money. Oh yeah, and at some point, Bocardo was forced out. Then he started multiple other motorcycle companies that also used car parts and failed. Okay, now we can finally return to semi-recent history. The Honda CTX 1300 may not have been a death trap or a one-off piece of junk, but it's definitely a motorcycle that fell short in just about every single way. For Honda's seemingly unending amount of resources and global footprint, they have always managed to make these once-in-a-decade flops that really make you scratch your head. The CTX 1300 was the successor to the ST 1300, which has been known as the Pan-European in Europe. The CTX abandoned the European sport touring flavor in favor of a more North American bias. It's a sport touring motorcycle designed to look like an American touring bagger that ultimately has the appeal of a power scooter. The CTX used a 1261cc longitudinal V4 that made just 81 claimed horsepower. Honda must have been working some serious magic to engineer a V4 engine that barely outperforms an air-cooled Harley-Davidson V-twin of the same size. Released for just one model year in 2014, the CTX was not long for this world. The CTX was an ill-fated middleman between a modern sport touring bike and a bloated bagger, and as a result managed to let down just about everyone. The CTX is one of those bikes where Honda, in an attempt to be so diverse and approachable, has created an ill-defined, underwhelming, and weirdly offensive motorcycle that appeals to no one. In the 1980s, President Reagan had a on for Harley-Davidson, a company that was struggling to compete with the innovative, modern, and powerful bikes coming for the Big Four out of Japan. In an attempt to quell the appetite of a free market that was hungry to eat HD for breakfast, he implemented import tariffs on a large displacement motorcycles. Ah yes, free market capitalism at work. And as a result, the Big Four made the obvious decision to put turbochargers on their smaller bikes. There was the CX650T, the XJ650 Turbo, and the GPZ750 Turbo, and the XN85. There was only one problem. For most intents and purposes, a turbocharger on a 1980s motorcycle is a terrible idea. These bikes had serious turbo lag, and the fueling technology was nowhere near optimized for a forced induction motorcycle. You'd be making moderate power in a corner, and then the turbo would spool up and increase power output exponentially at seemingly random parts of the power band. These bikes were also expensive and more complicated to work on. The tariffs lightened, naturally aspirated engines became more powerful, bikes became lighter with better handling, and the turbo bikes from the Big Four went by the wayside as quickly as they came into reality. The Yamaha GTS 1000 is a sport touring motorcycle with no front fork. The design was meant to improve stability while braking, but also added a slight disconnect between rider and motorcycle as the motorcycle did not always behave as anticipated. The new technology was added significantly to the price tag while providing negligible or non-existent benefits. The bike was scrapped in the US after just 1 year. You know what motorcycles have? Cheap bikes, expensive bikes, race-winning bikes, off-road bikes, and everything in between? A front fork. A forkless front suspension is a solution to a practically non-existent problem. Shortly afterwards, Yamaha released the FJR 1300 based on the FJR 1200, which has since remained a sport touring staple for the last 20 years. Don't mess with a good thing, that's all I'm saying. Large displacement two-stroke engines have a really special way of making riders no longer alive. You know what they say, mixing gas and breathing last. And nearly 100-year-old German dirt bike manufacturer MAICO has had a whole tenure of making merciless two-stroke machines under various ownership changes and company iterations. If you thought the Suzuki TM400 or the Honda CR500 were two-stroke monsters, they've got nothing on the lesser-known MAICO bikes. MAICO's own 490cc two-stroke was at one time hailed the best open-class motocross bike of all time. And in 1981, a new model was being tested, a 760cc two-stroke dirt bike that weighed just 10 pounds heavier than the 490 it was built upon. This bike made almost half of its power just a tick above idle. So the minute the throttle was opened, even the slightest, the rider was hit with a massive torque blast. This bike was so powerful that it had to be delivered detuned, making peak horsepower at just 4,000 RPM, lest the machine literally tear itself apart as it revved higher than a small engine. That's really crazy to think about, that just above idle, this 250-pound dirt bike made 26 wheel horsepower, and by 4,000 RPM, it was making 50. This is in 1981 too, with period-correct suspension, brakes, and chassis design. And since curses last for an eternity, some iteration of MAICO is still making motorcycles today, and they have a 2024 model year 685cc two-stroke Enduro for sale that makes 82 horsepower, and this bike can be yours for the low price of 18,000 euro. So there you go, get cursed. Thanks for making it to the end of the video. This was a fun one. Thanks so much to Room for support on today's video, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Fact: the inventor of the pop-up ad later apologized for creating it. Goodbye.